Yeah, I've got two. Okay, so we are now being recorded. Welcome back to day 3. So here's the agenda. I have 2 more slides and I'll come back to this to bash it. These are the URLs, just as a reminder. Yari has volunteered to help take some notes, but I think, people doing it collaboratively is good. So go to the pad and take notes of interesting things.
To be clear, I volunteered to take part of the notes, so other people are doing that as well. It's required, not optional.
Yeah, so more people, better notes, hopefully, yeah. There's the workshop thing and the Git repo. Slides for today, these slides are in the Git repo. And my last slide is some to-dos. So on the pad, can you check at some point that your name and affiliations at the in the list of people at the top? If you go and look at the URLs, if you made a submission, just check the right version, because there's some people updated some stuff. We may or may not have gotten it all correct. For the mic line for today, if and when we do need a mic line, just use the convention of putting in Q+ or +Q or something in WebEx chat like I just did. And I'll try and keep track of that. If I muck it up, then just yell at me. Notes are done. Towards the end of today, we'll also kind of look for some feedback about the format of this workshop. How should we think about this if we're going to have other workshops in future, post-pandemic even? And after, we'll start drafting or continue drafting the workshop report. I think that's in the Git repo that Maria's created a file there. So, please do read and comment on that. We'll send it out to the list. So with that, I wanted to just bash the agenda. So this is your chance to bash the agenda. Annie? Is everybody happy with that agenda? Understands what it is? I'm just looking for the slides with DSCP right now. So, it's our PDF.
Okay. Dominic's sent through a slide to you on email a short while ago, Stephen. I don't know if you picked it up.
I have that, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so I guess that'll be in, I presume that's in either the second or third bullet there on security or what we forgot. Okay, if that's agenda looks good, then Cullen.
Okay, so Jared and I put this together. I'm sort of talking for a second about, as an application type of guy that runs stuff over the network, what I wish the network gave me. And he's going to talk a little bit about why I might not be able to get that. So let me just jump into this pretty quickly here. So next slide. Particularly as people have moved to doing all this web conferencing, remote learning, online, we have all kinds of people working from home, obviously. And one of the real issues with that is prioritizing the packets on the downlink to people's homes, cable, whatever the technology is for that. There's no way of really doing that, and we end up with all of our stuff really mixed together. And I think that a big observation for me that came out of this COVID thing, and it had to do with YouTube and others moving their bandwidth rates down, was the last thing in the world that the vendors of those services wanted to have happen. Maybe not the last thing in the world, but one thing that they didn't want to have happen is people say, I've got to go to my class now. The other people in the house need to stop watching Netflix or YouTube or whatever it is, because my online class doesn't work while you're doing that. So it actually was in their interest to make it possible for people to still use the experience, but to reduce the quality of the experience at some level in a way that allowed everything to work together. And there's a lot of discussions back and forth between various companies on this, between various lawyers, and how to decide how to do that and make it work. And it worked out. It did work out. At most points in time, at most places, you could run a video streaming service and a web conferencing application simultaneously. But that would have been a crapload easier to do had there been some way and would have worked a lot better if there was some way to prioritize data going down the downlink. And of course, this has been known for many years. We'd like to do this, but it's always been one of those things like this won't work because somebody else will steal all the bandwidth of it, and there'll be no fair way to allocate it. And I think the observation from COVID that's a little bit, or from this COVID-19 time is a little bit different, is that was actually wrong, our assumptions about people's motivations. Only the big apps matter, okay? If tons of little small apps decide to steal it, it makes almost no difference. It's only what the large gorillas that use significant bandwidth across people's time do matters. Users at home can turn on and off apps and use them or not use them in ways that control what happens to their network. And they have a desire to have something to have on their network. And the various competing services, whether, YouTube, WebEx, Zoom, Netflix, all of these, it's in their interest to find a way to prioritize that traffic to work together. So if there was a very simple sort of less than best effort and a sort of higher and lower priority, sort of a very minimal diff-serve code point marking on the downlink to the home, I think it would help a lot on that. Whether that's possible or not, I mean, we'll go to the next slide in just a second here, but that's sort of the desired goal from an application point of view. Does that make sense, or any questions about what the desire is, not the discussion of the reality of delivering that desire?
I think Jason has a question in the chat.
L4S. Jason, Jason, can you just comment on that and talk about it a little bit? I mean, there's no better person in the world to discuss this than you.
I don't know about that, but I guess the question is, there's been a lot of debate about the sort of last remaining code point and L4S being one of those things. So like a low latency marking that could be used by an app. It's something that DOCSIS networks are working on at the moment. But this has been discussed for a while. I mean, honoring DSCP markings has always been challenging across domain borders, of course. Maybe this is pointing out in your example here a potential use case that would be interesting. So I sort of wonder generally, is that the use case that L4S could fill?
Yeah, I think L4S would fill this no problem. Or I think there's many ways to skin this cat. L4S, I think, probably would meet the needs. And my personal belief is the first set of ISPs in the world that manage to offer a great gaming experience that's better are just going to have this viral marketing mechanism going for them that's going to be insane.
I want to jump in here with I think two things. I think Cullen,
why don't we go to the next slide? Why don't you do that slide?
Well, so I want to talk about your slide for 1 second. So you mentioned just prioritizing the downstream, and you didn't mention prioritizing the upstream. So if I have multiple different services in my home or multiple different users, there may be different tiers. Maybe I care more about my place video chat. I care about my kids' school video chat, or maybe I care more about the kids' school video chat than I do my work chat, because I can go and move to a cellular network or something where for my 1 hour audio call or something. Or something else. So I think we need to remember, obviously the internet is bidirectional, and there's different buffering behaviors, see buffer bloat that exist in devices when they end up queuing and prioritizing packets and that behavior. So I think we need to be mindful of that.
Sure. Totally agree. I don't mean to oversimplify that, but all of these apps are doing diff-serve code point markings across the Wi-Fi network and inside the home, and the home wireless routers, NATs, things, whatever, do something with those fairly often. Now, all the things they do are sort of wrong, but they're not so wrong we can't sort of make it work. So that hasn't been our biggest pain point.
And I think the second thing is that quite often there's not a diversity of provider selection available. And that also poses its own challenge, is that, you may be stuck with like a DSL or DOCSIS network option, or maybe a fiber to the home versus DOCSIS as the two solutions. And it may be challenging for an end user to actually get the network service that they desire. So even if you say, hey, I'm going to switch to Jason's network because it's better for gaming, Jason's network isn't universally available because maybe it's Time Warner Cable or something in that area, or Charter, or maybe it's Atlas or some other cable company.
So we've had many problems about whether a broadband access is a duopoly or a monopoly or what cartel or whatever it is. But I mean this doesn't help solve any of those things. But boy, in the places where there are, I think that problem is a separate problem which will take care of it, which does take care of itself, over time. But right now we don't have the technology for them to compete on that level. Like there's no, it's difficult, I think, today. I shouldn't even say these words. I don't run one of these. You go, both of you guys do, but it seems difficult for people to compete on this network would be really awesome for gaming or for Zoom calls today than just basically, we offer, however many megabits per second of download.
So we have a couple of questions. Larry, I think your question was in first, and then Andrew.
One of the things people have expressed an interest in is just some kind of diagnostic that they could tell whether or not the problem is their problem with their video call is that other people in the house are using up the bandwidth to play games, or it's somewhere downlink, or it's not even your connection at all, it's somebody else's problem. It's really hard to diagnose these things either on the fly or at a given time. I mean, maybe this is a simple tool that people could use to figure out why their bandwidth is being limited and make an informed choice about, you go and tell everyone to turn up their video, and it doesn't actually help you at all.
Look, it's very true, and this is a constant problem. I think all the people phone up WebEx and say your WebEx call sucks, and we don't know whether it's WebEx was the problem, or the Wi-Fi network was the problem, or the WAN link was the problem. And it's quite often one of those three. But it's really hard to tell which one of the three to blame. Or it was the problem.
What kind of diagnostics or tools could you use to help people make more informed choices?
Being able to talk to the access point and get privacy sensitive information about what was happening across the Wi-Fi link versus what was happening across the WAN link upstream of that would be really amazingly useful. And I think that that's an area that IETF could drive standards on is how to get management diagnostics information from access points about the app's own about the app's own flows. I want to be very highly privacy sensitive here. I don't think you have to reveal information that the app doesn't already know. You're just revealing which side of the access point the problem happened on.
I think we had Andrew.
Yeah, so a couple of points just to sort of chime in with their first one, which is also, I think, popped up in the chat. The sort of US markets conditions are not the same. So the conditions in other markets are not the same as in the US. So in other words, and I've seen this in other fora, so IETF fora, there's a low level of knowledge, certainly in some of the apps developers, about the conditions that apply in non-US markets, which causes decisions to be made which are non-optimal in most of the world or lots of other parts of the world, certainly markets far bigger than the US. So I think that can be an issue. I'm not saying that's necessarily true here, but it's certainly an issue in some discussions. It also occurs to me that to answer some of these questions, and again, I've seen these surface in other places, maybe occasionally talking to some of the service providers would be a good thing. And I'm not suggesting, by the way, that Cullen wasn't going to get there on this or hasn't done that in the past. I should add. And then finally, some of these problems could be solved by service providers, I believe, but I would politely observe that some of the developments within the IETF and the direction of travel is to obscure a lot of this data to make it impossible for service providers to do network management to provide a good user experience. And I don't think some of the people doing the protocols fully understand the implications of what they're doing. And that from an end user experience point of view, that can be really bad. And dare I say, not consistent with RFC 8890, for example. So I thought I'd just throw those in for discussion.
So actually, I'll just interject myself briefly before going to Brian in the queue. I mean, I don't disagree with what you're saying, Andrew. However, people are encrypting protocols for good reasons, and we need to remember that too. So I think we have Brian in the queue.
Right, this is WebEx. I get to unmute myself. Yeah, so I'm going to get through this whole thing without saying spinbit. Too late. I think there's so I'm gonna, what I said in the chat is, a lot of environments, sort of like either cloud development environments or sort of like large, development environments like the one that I deal with at my day job, give you the ability to do sort of like full end-to-end sampled RPC traces, right? And they're super, 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 super useful for figuring out what broke. And a lot of the functionality that we're asking for here, like if we built an alternate architecture that was sort of at the RPC layer as opposed to at the network layer, and you had sort of, some sort of like distributed broker thing, like some of the, I think some of the work in the 1980s was going in this direction, you could actually slot RPC tracing into the internet. You can't do that. A lot of the work that, that is being done to obscure information that has been used for passive measurement in the past is not specifically targeted at obscuring the ability to trace, so full end to end. It's targeted at reducing the amount of unintentional radiation, right? So the amount of data that you didn't actually intend to put in the wire image that's there. I think there is a room for research into how you can get closer to this ideal of full end-to-end sort of flow disposition tracing and an on-demand environment, right? This would not be a thing where the ISP would say, here are all of the flows and here are all of the end-to-end characteristics of those flows. It would be more of a, you click a button in your web browser and it talks to all of the devices along the path that are enabled for doing this sort of tracing. In order to create a trace file, then you would be in control of handing to somebody, right? Like you need to design this in a way where, end user control of the metadata came first. And I think by not trying to hang that off of the way we've done this in the past, where you're unintentionally radiating stuff, you have the ability to do better than we've done in the past. If I knew how to do this in a way that would deploy, I'd be working on that right now. But I think it would be really, really useful to figure out what could be done incrementally in terms of sort of a research agenda and then invest in that.
Okay, so I see Jana in queue. We have one more slide on this topic, and times are marching as it does. So Jana, do you want to go now or wait for Jared to talk about this other slide? And either way, let's try and wrap this topic in the next 5-10 minutes.
Either one. You decide. You're the host.
Okay, why don't we let Jared present, and I'm sure you'll have a comment on that. So Jared, you have a
Sure.
slide?
I'm happy to talk to Jana at length about anything. So when Cullen and I were discussing this the other day, I said, hey, well, here's why the ISPs need the DSCP markings. The big thing is, when I previously worked at a large service provider, we have business models, we have SLAs around performance, but obviously we can only control the performance on our own network. We can't control a third party, we can't control interconnect points, and that's why many companies end up building their own private networks. And there's advantages for this. Enterprise networks, they tend to pay more money than wholesale customers. You give them a higher SLA, and you use a limited number of DSCP bits to, generally provide like a bronze, a silver, or a gold type solution, for that. Customers also tend to be very sticky on these services, and they'll actually pay to extend my network, to locations where they say, oh, well, I'm building a new office park here. I already have, either this MPLS service or some other service from you. I want to extend networks. So not only do I get the benefit of my network being extended by these people, I'm also tending to charge them a lot higher revenue than I would for just a wholesale IP connection. The other thing is, when it comes to the technical implementation on the routers, once you configure any sort of rate shaping on the devices, generally it will, depending on the platforms, but many of them by default will stomp on all the DSCP bits. So you have to go in and do active configuration on all the ports on the devices, and you have to classify them really well. So you understand which ones are infrastructure links, which ones are customer links, which ones are somewhere in between, because sometimes you have things like that. And many customers, at least on the wholesale side, they really want a liability limit. They may say, I'm going to connect to you with a 10 gig port so I can later come back and upgrade my contract, but I don't want to pay for more than 2 gigs of traffic. That way they can budget accurately. And the other thing is that when it comes to these the bit usage, there really is not, aside from a few of them, there's not really, a consistent standard, and there's no incentive for interprovider, QS or DSCP markings to ensure that they interoperate. And that, I think, is really, really the big thing, is that there's not a market incentive for people. In fact, there's a disincentive to say, no, I want to have these people be sticky on my network such that I can control it. And provide that controlled experience that customer is paying a premium for. So getting those across network boundaries, very unlikely. And I can call the queue if you want, Stephen. Shanna?
Thanks for that, Jared. I was just going to speak to something slightly different from earlier. But that's basically the point I was trying to make. The top point that I wanted to make is that we were talking about observability and being able to do these things with traffic going through the networks. I was going to say that at a high level, I think we need to start thinking broadly about observability and tooling differently than we have in the past. I mean, we have traditionally thought about tooling in particular ways with service providers, with operators, and there's always been contention between that and traffic in the network. And Brian already mentioned Spinbit, and here I am mentioning it for a second time. So you truly ruined everybody's day now. But I think that I do think that there's a real problem here in terms of us being able to see what's happening both at the end users in terms of what the quality of experience is for end users ultimately, and what's happening in the network from an application's point of view, for example. And I think that I would personally be more interested in talking about more explicit measurements on aggregates and various such things, making those kinds of things visible across ISP boundaries, instead of constantly trying to do this on a per flow basis. Because we don't actually, that information is perhaps useful at the endpoints, but pretty much nowhere else is that information, per flow information, really that useful. Like I said, I do think that this is an important problem to solve, but I think we need to walk away and try to walk away from individual flows. We've traditionally used individual flows because I believe that's where information has been available. Service providers have used individual flows because they could look into TCP there, find out what is happening to the connection, use that as a proxy for what's happening to the aggregate, and so on and so forth. And I think tooling has to move away from that towards more explicit signaling of network conditions, of network quality, of what's happening on the network.
Robin, I think you're up.
Oh. Hello, Jared. Can you hear me?
Yeah, hear you fine.
Okay. So my question is here is the DSCP, the ISP need the DSCP, but I have this the question is the DSCP code point is enough for the ISPs for the purpose of the marketing the portable service?
I think the reality of things like DSCP is that there's really insufficient bit space available for the levels of mappings that you might need. You might have an application that wants to say, you know, I'm willing to go into the junk queue and kind of be overflow. You know, and service providers, if there's a standard bit space that says, hey, I don't want to, you know, I don't want my equipment to stomp on this. I want to be able to read that signal, and then whether or not I act on that signal on a policy basis, you know, based upon the configuration, I think is, you know, is something that's feasible. Like at Akamai, we have people internally who are saying, hey, I want to set DSCP on certain classes of traffic. And we say, well, we use some of these bits internally. I've got competing people who want to use that same limited bit space. I think this is something where, you know, if we are going to build a fully differentiated internet, where in the future, if we want to develop that type of an architecture where we can have application signal it, have end user signal it, and have network signal these behaviors, we need a lot more bit space available to be able to do that. You know, and that I think is really kind of the crux of the situation, is that there is such a limited space available.
Okay. My second one is that because of the DSCP, you also mentioned that we must be carefully to classify the traffic to the different DSCP. But also, I think the proposed challenge, because the DSCP is an indirect way. So I think that's maybe, I wonder if some of this the direct way, such based on the destination IP address, or this can also be used. Because from my point of view, I mean so that DSCP marking sometimes is not a direct.
Yeah, and I think, you know, there's some opportunity to do things, and you see some of that in, you know, so we have some people internally who've proposed the idea of using the DSCP bits to essentially say, I want to use the DSCP bit to pick a different forwarding table on the device, as one of the, you know, as one of the solution spaces, versus doing, you know, a full segment routing or other types of implementation, which might be, you know, or a label, you know, or a label based lookup to identify which forwarding table to use, because not all the devices that are in the path may be, you know, either label aware, or you know, we may not want to pay for the licensing, or or whatever may come into play with that. You know, this broadly comes down to an economic question, and in most cases for the service provider, it is cheaper to add bandwidth than it is to configure DSCP correctly.
The problem is no amount of adding bandwidth solves the basic problem that we have, and that's the part that people, I mean, you see that in the L4S work, you see that in buffer bloat work. I mean, the problem is not lack of bandwidth necessarily, right? The problem is how things are queued in that bandwidth. And there are many ways to solve that cat too. I'm not saying this is the only way to skin that cat, but it's just you know.
So I guess the queue seems to be me, Brian, Jana, and then Matt. And maybe we tail off this topic a little and move on to the next one. On the question of observability, I mean, I think that this is certainly something worth looking at. It's something that can be quite hard. So the recent thing I've been looking at in this space has been around these kind of COVID tracing apps. And it turns out that you could, on the one hand, say this is a great victory for privacy by design, because the actual protocol for doing this COVID tracing is pretty good. On the other hand, you could say this is pretty shit, because at least in one implementation on Android, it's also implemented as part of Google Play services, which is actually not very good from a privacy point of view, because it keeps calling home to Google in various ways. So it's unclear to me whether we can really tie this down at a protocol level or not. I think we could. It's certainly worth thinking about how you would make things more sensibly observable in a privacy-friendly way. I think that's definitely worth looking at. I'm not sure how well we can kind of address that on a per protocol basis. And equally, I'm very skeptical that we could come up with some great overarching, here's what I let you observe about everything I do. So I don't know if it's really an easily solvable problem at all. And that was me. So, and then we had Brian and Jana and Matt.
So on the observability point, I just want to go to something that Jared just said that I put in the notes, and it kind of struck me, right? Like, we're talking about, research into sort of like distributed tracing, privacy preserving distributed tracing for network performance, right? Which I agree is a very hard problem. I don't think it's an unsolvable problem, because at least on the technical side of things, we do RPC sampling at large scales in many environments which are not only single provider, single administrative domain. But we're talking about things that are going to be, fiddly and twitchy, and things that are fiddly and twitchy are also opportunities for network vendors to charge additional licensing fees. And the thing that Jared said to me is, like, for the service provider, adding bandwidth is cheaper than turning DSCP on, right? Like, DSCP is 1 bit, right? We're talking about, or 1 byte. It's 6 bits, but it usually gets treated as 8 bits, which is why ECN doesn't work. And if we can't figure out how we're going to economically turn 6 bits of signaling on, more than 6 bits of signaling is going to be harder to deploy as well. I still think it's worth. So what you said, Stephen, about like this not being necessarily the protocol issue, I think it probably isn't a protocol issue, and probably we even the IETF in this discussion focus too much on which bits do we put on, and a little bit less on what is the interaction model, right? Like, so who's in control of when something gets measured, and who's in control of how that data flows. And I think stepping back from the protocol a little bit and working on that problem might be a way to break that particular logjam. But keep in mind that, like, if we can say that adding bandwidth is cheaper than turning DSCP on for a service provider, then maybe we should just invest in adding bandwidth.
Okay, I think I have Jana and then Matt in the queue, and I'm suggesting that after that we move on to the next topic, unless somebody else about it.
I just want to comment back to Brian real quick and say that I can buy like a 32 by 400 gig box for less than 10 grand. And so for adding the bandwidth, like if I'm going to pay software license for MPLS, it's probably going to be equivalent cost, and I'm going to pay that per device.
Jana?
Thanks, Stephen. So I agree with what Brian said. I think that this is definitely not a protocol issue, in my opinion. And I think in terms of just the protocol issue, I actually, on this particular point, I'll say I agree with Jared's slide here. I think the ship has sailed on using DSCP for anything but what it's being used for. But that's my personal opinion. It doesn't hold that much. It's used extensively within ISPs, and it's used extensively for reasons that hardware does what you want to do with DSCP, and you can define these code points to mean whatever you want them to mean, and hardware will do it for you at line speed, and that's really useful, and it gets used all over the place because of that. So using it as an end-to-end signal of something is a very, very long shot. But on the other hand, if we move away from the protocol itself and we step back and ask the questions that may have very different answers than what they did 20, 30 years ago, we could ask the questions of what is important to observe, what do we want to signal end-to-end, what do we want to agree on end-to-end, and so on. And those could be explicit. And like I said earlier, they need not be at the flow level. I think there's a question of mechanism here, but we do need to talk about what it is that we want to communicate across the network and which entities ought to be able to see that. Protocol and signaling is a separate matter, but I don't think we have agreement on that first question.
Matt?
Find the unmute button. I wanted to second this in a different way. There's another sort of fundamental reason why bandwidth is cheaper than control. I'll put it that way, and that is during non-crisis time, not having enough bandwidth means that you end up having to arbitrate which of your customers can watch high definition video. If everybody wants to watch high definition video, if you want to support that, then you have to have enough headroom where all other QoS problems are easy for most users. I would be surprised if DSCP actually has much effect during non-crisis times in ISPs. I don't have any data on that, just because bandwidth is cheaper than control. In crisis, and then the other thing that people want to have is controlling the last mile because of low delay applications and the large queues being at the last mile. So it makes sense there in the default sort of environment. In crisis environment, it's a very different problem, and that's what we hit in the COVID situation, the COVID bump. And there, it's you really do need trained bandwidth, and at that point, we're not underusing QoS in the sense since we're not using the signaling or haven't been using the signaling, we're not appropriately configured to do the right thing with it. And manual traffic management, telling people you have to get off now, is always a fallback for the home users.
I would ask just one question clarifying about what you said there. Could you say what you think is different between the sort of crisis time and the non-crisis time about any of the apps running over the network? Because I'm not seeing it.
If it's not a crisis time, as a business concern for access to ISPs, they want all their customers to be able to support streaming video. It's, whatever their economic reality is, but some large fraction of their users support video, and that load is so much larger than everything else. The aggregate of that load is so much larger than everything else that everything sort of fits in underneath it, right?
Okay, we could talk about Avlon, but I do not think that's true. If you, whether it's pre-COVID or non-COVID, running video in a Zoom call and a YouTube call at the same time always compete with each other, and they both can drive the video bandwidth beyond whatever bandwidth you have available. No matter what bandwidth you have available across, broadly available, they will both deliver services at a higher bandwidth than that. Right?
But they need to arbitrate. They need to arbitrate between two similar,
which they do a great job of doing, of scaling such the service so they do that. But I don't understand how that's different during COVID times and non-COVID times.
The issue is it's the high pressure on smaller services, things like file sharing, document sharing, email, and such like that, which are perhaps more economically important. Web transactions for doing purchasing, ordering, and stuff like that, which is all relatively low bandwidth and actually not latency sensitive. Making video calls work well under crisis does require a good QoS service.
Okay, I'm going to suggest we kind of move on because I suspect some of the same discussion will come up under security or anything else anyway. So, and so the next topic people I think wanted to talk about was kind of generic sort of security effects, and I think there's kind of two directions here. One is like, what kind of new threats or changes in threats did we see during the course of the pandemic? And I guess the other kind of direction is what kind of security tools did we have that we started using more during the pandemic and so on. I don't think I have anybody sent me explicit slides on this, unless Dominique's one is intended for this bullet. I wasn't clear. So what I was just going to do is is Kirsty on the call today? I guess so, or not? I haven't looked. Kirsty, yeah. So I was just going to pop up the mail you sent, and maybe use that just to kind of kick off some discussion, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, that's me. Thanks.
I'm not sure. I have no idea how visible that is to people, but you could have got them out last night anyway.
That's quite legible, Stephen.
Good. Okay, so quite legible or illegible?
Sorry, legible.
Oh, good. That's a nice surprise. So why don't we let Kirsty talk to that mail, and maybe that'll just kind of lead us into the discussion. And Dominique's slides are for the next topic. That's fine. So Kirsty, you want to chat about this?
Yeah, sure. I guess this is because on Wednesday I raised kind of the security posture that we were seeing during the COVID stuff, really. So since March, really for the NTSC, we just published our annual review, and it's been a kind of year of two halves where we have the before March, kind of normal business as usual, and then the post-March, where the NTSC's workbook looked very different. So some of the stuff you might be aware of, like COVID apps and all that kind of stuff. But what I'm really focusing on here is the shift in attacks that we saw. So what's quite difficult, I suppose, in conjunction to a lot of the stuff we've already seen, where there's a lot of graphs and nice measurements, and you can see a real uptick in traffic volumes and stuff. What we see instead is maybe not an uptick in total attacks, but a shift in the lures being used and the attacker behavior and a shift in targets. So I think it's going to be quite hard to look at kind of numbers to really get across what we saw as an impact. So the impact here is not necessarily an overall increase in certain things. It's just more a pivot from attackers. So I can describe a bit of this email. It's just taken from our annual reviews. It's very high level gisted stats. But we have this takedown service where if we see a malicious URL, then we can contact the service and get them to take down. Usually the URL is taken down because of copyright, actually, from using a government logo, which is quite amusing. But they're taken down for various reasons. And so you can see some stats here in terms of this latest year, how many were taken down across the whole year. So 166,710 phishing URLs that were discovered were taken down. And of course, these are just ones that have been discovered. So I don't know how many there are in total, but these are the ones we discovered and were taken down. You can see what proportion were associated with UK government-themed attacks. And then there's just a nice bit that our global share reduced. So that's a nice success story for us. But then since March, we have a focus on what the coronavirus themes that began to be used. And this is kind of relating, I suppose, to my position paper a bit, that in terms of a pandemic situation, like we haven't studied, I think is an interesting question. If in a pandemic situation, you're isolated, you might be spending a lot more time online than you would be before. And so your tolerance to phishing might decrease. You might be more keen for news. You might be feeling a bit more vulnerable. You might just be a bit more susceptible in general to phishing. So there's a socio-technical element to that we haven't researched fully. But for whatever reason, coronavirus themes began to be used. And you can see the split there in terms of what they were associated with, selling bogus PPE, like preying on people's fears to sell vaccines and stuff. Some were just using that as a hook to get money, quite a lot of them. Some were just to distribute malware. And so what can we say about this? So Stephen, I saw you came back with a request for how this compared to last year. And sorry, I've been quite busy today, so I haven't fully found this. But I guess what I did find our annual review from the previous year. And so in the previous year, we actually took down 177,000 phishing URLs, which was roughly 23,000 attacks per group. And so what can you deduce from that? Actually, maybe we just got worse at detecting phishing. You'd like to think year on year we're getting better. So in theory, the number of phishing URLs discovered should increase, perhaps. It's very hard to quantify that. Or if it at least stays static, we can say, okay, why did we have a reduction in this? It might be because different access sectors other than phishing were found. Like there might have been a better way to gain access. One specific example is the increase in VPN vulnerability exploitation. So we saw an increase in scanning for those vulnerabilities. And that you could hypothesize is because there's more chance that a target you're interested in is using a VPN service, right? Like if it's being more commonly used. Again, it's quite hard to definitively point to that and to measure it, but we can just, in a qualitative way, we can say that we've seen attacks where that has been the initial foothold, whereas in other campaigns, perhaps it would be more of a phishing email. So yeah, the numbers themselves are just kind of illustrative, I suppose. We have a lot of experience and yeah, we've had a lot of incidents that we've managed that have dealt with COVID as the lure, as the theme. And so I suppose it's just kind of what's really interesting, I suppose, is that pre-March, basically there were no campaigns using this at all. And then post-March, we saw a rapid increase in like domain registrations for coronavirus related names. Some of those are legitimate, but quite a lot were not. And so I guess it's just kind of what we haven't really seen before is this sudden from zero to a lot of attacks using a certain lure. So people are quite used to the tax office getting in touch saying you've got tax rebate. But where they, in terms of our 4 layers of phishing prevention and stopping that attack being successful, like educating users is only one of those layers, and that layer might have been less effective. And so I guess one of my open questions that I think got posted around is like, given that users might be less effective in a phishing layer defense, do we have to do something on the other 3 layers? And this relates kind of to the NCSC launching the vulnerability and suspicious email reporting service, so that you are able to kind of increase that layer of defense. But it's just a question that's still quite a manual intervention. So I guess that's kind of all I have to say about that email. I can send some follow-up stats, but like I said, I feel like comparing absolute numbers is not telling the full story, because there is a narrative in terms of per incidents. There are some advisories that describe this as well, but like for various incidents, the initial attack vector is different, the lure used is different, even the target set is different. So we're seeing sectors that haven't been targeted before now being targeted, because what they have in a pandemic situation is perceived to be more valuable. So yeah, that's kind of all for me. Thanks, Stephen, for the opportunity to talk this through.
Yeah, I guess, and thanks for kind of having a look back at last year's numbers. And yeah, I think you're right. They're not as easily comparable as kind of bit rates from year to year. I think one thing I take away from this is that probably in terms of measuring security and so on, there's work to be done in figuring out what things to measure and how to do it. Because I mean, you see the kind of annual reporting from like the likes of yourselves or from some security vendors that produce these interesting reports every year, but they're not commensurate with each other. They're not even necessarily commensurate from year to year with the same kind of source. So I think there's probably some how do we measure interesting security things work to be done. The second thing I was wondering about, and I don't know the answer here either, is everybody working from home presumably does create some new kind of, it changes the kind of risk in various ways. Some obvious ways it might create more risk or more likelihood of an attack succeeding. And I think you called it a couple of those. It might also have the opposite impact too, because we may have been moving from a place where a lot of people were doing like a little bit of work at home or using some really unmanaged 5-year-old laptop that's still running a bad version of an operating system. And then they moved to actually having a little bit of help from their sysadmins or being given a laptop to bring home, which I think happened in a lot of cases. And that might actually have improved security for them and decreased risk, but we don't know. So yeah, I guess my main thing on this topic is that it would be great to figure out how to measure things a bit better, because I'm not sure I've seen good discussion of the effect of the pandemic. Now, maybe also that might happen. Maybe there's a whole bunch of papers going to be at NDSS next January, February, whatever, and then it'll have been done. But I haven't seen it so far, at least. I think I have Maria in the queue, and I don't know if anybody else wants to be in the queue, but if you do, type +Q in the WebEx chat. Maria.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for sharing this data. That's actually interesting. I do have a question more on your other mail a little bit, because you said that we should think about protocol work to address vulnerabilities in the remote remote working infrastructure. But this is kind of, it's still a little bit high level for me, because the remote infrastructure is not like the one infrastructure everybody uses it, right? It's like different components, it's conferencing tools, it's VPNs, and so on. So I think I don't have a good understanding if there's anything special about this infrastructure that we didn't consider yet, or it's just like a bunch of applications that we've been talking about. And then the other point is also that I think a lot of the problems we've seen, and including the one about Zoom, for example, that you mentioned as an example, is really people not applying our protocols correctly or not like developing an application in a secure way. Even so, I think like certain security standards are well known. So it's really an educational problem rather than a protocol problem. And so like currently we're discussing this at a very high level. We need to do something because there obviously is a problem, but it's not clear who should be doing it, at which layer, and you know what exactly. So we need a much deeper dive in there. Or do you have further thoughts or insights?
Can I come back on your point and also Stephen's before. So yeah, so the question I'm asking is, I mean, it's not presupposing anything can be done, actually. Like, we might take an honest look at this and say, actually, we've done everything we could do from the protocol side of things, and yeah, the solutions lie elsewhere. It's a question to be asked, like, what could be done? So I guess, like, phishing is a very easy example where we know we have 4 layers, and helping users and educating them is only one of those layers, right? And so we can do what we can do in that layer. And we've done a lot of socio-technical research on what lands best there. But the other layers, in terms of like making it harder for attackers to reach your users in the first place, like, is there something that can be done there? Is it just encouraging uptake of existing protocols that are already out there? I think it's just a question, and it's not presupposing anything can be done, right? It's just like a question for me when we think about the network impact. Yeah, so I mean, for infrastructure, you're right, like, it's a range of stuff. I think for me, I'm specifically thinking about people using new technologies and not knowing how well that's being done, like not having a good appreciation. And that's partly because of a shift in user demographic. Like, people were spending more time online, but also people who would barely spend any time online before were now spending a lot more time online because that was their main way of getting groceries delivered. That was their way of keeping in touch with their families. And so from a citizen point of view, that's kind of our focus, and that's what we're thinking about. And then you have, obviously, from an enterprise point of view, like Stephen said, people being given a laptop and told to go home. And for some companies, that may have improved their security posture. But I think where we have seen incidents has been obviously where that hasn't worked well. And so a poor rollout of infrastructure, or a rushed, I mean, in fairness, it's not poor, it's just time constrained, and it's difficult when you have a large fleet to manage. Where we've seen that been done poorly or outdated, software being used, and so vulnerabilities exist that are being exploited. That's the kind of stuff we talk about. I guess it is unfortunate because for security, unless you're in the industry, and there are some people on this call, I think, who are kind of experts in this field, and you are actually managing incidents, then we're not going to make exact details of an exact attack public. It's very difficult to anonymize it. And obviously we care a lot about the privacy of people and organizations and reputational risk and stuff. So, but what we can say is that, you know, as a group of incidents, as a collection that we manage, we have seen increases that we ascribe due to the shift into home working and the rise in VPNs and the rise in like these kind of vulnerability, rise in users who are being more vulnerable, who are spending longer online and have more access to these kind of security scams than perhaps previously. And so, yeah, the open question really is just, we've done so far a manual intervention, the suspicious email reporting service, like, could other stuff be done? And that is just the question, not presupposing the answer in any way.
Okay, I think the queue has Liksha.
Let me just make a few simple points. The first one is, how do we view this QVAD? Is this just a network connectivity challenge? Then we measure ourselves whether we succeeded or not solving this one problem at this time. I think a different view of the QVAD is actually, this is kind of an amplifier that amplified or exposed more widely the already existing problems in the internet. I think security is one such area because COVID amplified the role of the internet in the society, forced many people who previously didn't depend on the internet to do their business, but now they do. So let's not think about, oh, we handled bandwidth well, so we succeeded in QVAD. I mentioned, I think I added into the Etherpad notes that handling the backbone internet or whatever, anything beyond last mile, that's where we spend years. So we know how to handle those stuff. It is the connectivity to the residency area. That's where not much attention has been paid. And we fall short in tools, in understanding, and in solutions. But I want to go back about the security. Sorry for taking so long. Education for security has been there for as long as I can remember. The question we need to ask ourselves is how effective it has been. If one can learn from the past, you can project in the future how effective it can be. Another thing is about the IETF, that we've been spent so much efforts on security. There's a number of working groups developed the solutions. You know, DNSSEC is the first one I got involved a bit. Then there is a BGP security. Then there's a DKIM. And there's other things. My pro memory cannot remember much. The question is, how much effort have we put in, and how effective they have been? This relates to yet another question. How do we handle security? Is it security by layers, and each layer will do their own thing independent from others? Is it security by applications? Every application take care of themselves. I'm not suggesting solution one way or the other, but I think whichever way the IB believes, let's write it down and see if the community agrees and open that discussion. I just so far haven't seen any clear documentation. What is our kind of a basic approach to address the security challenges? I can be pessimistic, I really do, but I don't think security is getting better. I think it's getting way worse compared to even just 10 years ago, despite all our effort. And why is so?
So Nisha, I'm not clear what you mean there. Can you give me an example of what's worse now than 10 years ago? Because I don't know if
I would just say a very simple thing, DDoS. I think the threat of DDoS is getting bigger. Look at the magnitude. They grow a lot faster than actually the bandwidth, the raw bandwidth grows in terms of percentage. In terms of the scale, in 2010, we didn't have any scale of DDoS like the Mariah attack had.
So, sorry.
Yeah, and in terms of the fake news today, I don't remember we had anything similar back 10 years. You might think that's way beyond the IETF coverage, yes, but it's a security piecemeal solution. We take care of our own piece, or there's something much bigger picture. We have to take an overall view. So I would just end up here. I think that how we handle security, I think we need to take a broader view than just develop a specific solution like DKIM and focus on that one. If I'm saying DKIM as an example, there's all the security solutions so far, to me, is a piecemeal. I'm done.
Okay, I think we had DKG and Yari in the queue.
Hi there. So Kirsty, I wanted to thank you for calling out the range of different kinds of security issues that and reliability issues that come up with the messages that you sent to the list with COVID. And it occurs to me from thinking about what you've written that we're really in a scenario that is sort of like the September that never ended, right? Like when the web, suddenly became something that the general public used, there was this huge influx of new users, and there were a lot of things that had worked for folks who were comfortable sort of digitally before it became obvious that they were sort of falling apart. And I think maybe one of the things that you're pointing to is that as we had a sudden influx of people who weren't used to living online, who suddenly became used to living online, those folks became vulnerable to all the things that maybe, I don't know, digital natives were more used to working around or detecting as bogus, talking about phishing or spam, whatever. A huge part of that has nothing to do with protocols. It has to do with user interface and user expectations and how we manage and set those things. And I know that the IETF doesn't do stuff at that layer. But we do things that provide inputs to those layers, and could provide guidance that, like how be done without saying, you have to show this many pixels of warning or whatever. But it seems to me like what you're talking about is that we really need to do more to think about what kinds of indicators our tools can present to users so that they can help to distinguish between, say, a phishing attack and a regular email from their boss. So anyway, it seems to me like there's a question about not only user interface research, but protocol level research about what indicators do we think the user interface people need to be able to expose effectively, or how to make them actionable. And I would be interested in seeing that kind of work done. I think we have a responsibility at the IETF to think more about those questions than we have in the past.
Okay, I think we have Yari and then Jana in the queue. And we probably also want to take a break shortly, so let's aim to take a break in, like I say, before 10 past the hour, and take 5 minutes and then come back. So let's go ahead for now.
Yeah, just very briefly, I think, first of all, we're, I guess, discussing an area which is not necessarily exactly on the scope of this workshop, but there are obviously lots of problems in the internet, and security as a broad category is maybe the worst of those problems, and we need to address that. And lots of work is ongoing to make improvements there, and maybe more work should happen. Or I believe at least that more work should happen. But I guess just commenting quickly on Lisa, what you were saying, I think there's we could have a debate about, is the situation now better or worse? We've made also a lot of improvements, and situation is in some ways better, but there's also, we can probably also, everybody on this call can agree that there are huge problems left, and we should do something about those. I think where we might actually disagree a little bit is how we go about that. So I actually do believe what you said about this holistic approach, that we should look at the thing as a whole. I do not, however, believe that there's one tool or one solution that solves these different issues, because it's like a very different problem to protect communications, for instance, compared to protecting data or being worried about the influence of some parties who have access to more data than some others do. So I think we'll probably have many different things, and there are ongoing efforts to deal with some of those, and we should have more efforts targeted towards this. But if you look at some proposals for, let's fix this internet security problem, you often find that they are, even if they claim that this is like the holistic approach, they actually turn out to be a very narrow solution. And in fact, they often have also some major problems in their design. So let's not jump too easily to those sort of simple one solution fits all needs answers. That's all I want to say.
Jana, and then maybe let's take that break when we get to 10 past, or when Jana's done.
I'm stopping everybody from going to the bathroom. That's not a good place to be. Sorry. I'll make a quick comment. At a high level, I think that Lisa's point is definitely something that it resonates with many of us. I think that security cannot be piecemeal, that we have to do a high level, we have to do a consolidated solution. It has to be one piece, not piecemeal. At the same time, we have two other issues which always in my mind dominate some of these conversations. One of them is incentive and control. We might have incentive, but we don't have control. Each one of us here controls small pieces, unfortunately, which is partly why you end up with this piecemeal solution, because a person who's deploying something ends up wanting to deploy something that they can secure. And like the IAB or the IETF are places where we can have these conversations and other vendors come together, but we still have to incentivize each one of those entities to deploy such a thing. That's at the simplest level. Encrypting at the protocol has so much tension between operators and endpoints. It's hard to imagine doing much more than that because practically there are limitations to how this unfortunately unfolds. I'd say that on the second side, I'd say also that there's part of the blame here lies, unfortunately, with you, Leisha, for building an internet that is fundamentally insecure. I mean, we don't have these basic hooks that we would now, if we were to build a network now, we would not build it without some nominal notion of security hooks and things like that. But the network is what it is, and I think as a result, bringing something piecemeal is what we end up having as a result of that. And finally, one last point on yes, it would be amazing to be able to include. So when you're building something piecemeal, you're trying to define the attack very precisely and trying to protect against very precise attacks that you can cover, you can limit against, and you build for those attacks. If we think of fake news as an attack, it walks into another territory, which again, the protocol developers and others have shied away from, which is values and trying to arbitrate what is good and what is not. I'd love to have a conversation, but I just feel like this is not a conversation that I've successfully had in technical communities. And I also feel that if we can't, it'd be interesting for me to see if we can't solve this with humans in the loop, how we might solve this with just machines. It's a tough problem. I don't know how we would go about solving it.
Well, jump in, but it's, if we don't solve it, who's going to solve it? Or we just let it grow? But people should take a break.
Okay, so let's take that break. So are people able to come back in 5 minutes, or you need 10? I'm going to assume 5 in a little bit.
Works.
Right?
No, what's up?
I got a letter from Dr. Tynes, who I didn't really like that much. Leaving. So,
Oh no.
Nick, mute yourself.
Where's she going?
Uh-oh.
Hmm.
Okay, so it's 1:15 now. I guess we run for another 45 minutes. And we want to try and do that. So I put in some, we have these topics left. I put in some rough timings, about 10 minutes each, 5 minutes, try and wrap up with some actions, 5 minutes to take feedback. And that's not a huge amount of time, but we don't have much more than that. So I think we have one slide on this topic here from Dominique, which I guess I'll pop up. Any other, and then, so again, we want to do this pretty quickly. The slide has some nice kind of juicy topics that would easily take up all of the 45 minutes. So
yeah, sorry about that, Stephen. But there's been discussion on consolidation on Arch. That's been really good too. Yeah, so Andrew and I put in sort of a paper that's a bit left field, and we just wanted to kind of stir up some discussion. And actually, one thing I did want to say is one of the positive effects, I think, of COVID, because we were talking about both security and positive effects, has been connectivity, more people getting online. So that's been really cool to see. Yeah, so the internet's been resilient, and we had some great presentations. And what's going to happen in the future? We listed a couple trends, which we can discuss further, but just basically trends around protocol development that obviously, as someone said in the chat, that kind of limits the ability to look at data and traffic, but also kind of siphons that data towards endpoints a bit more. But also I threw in digital sovereignty, you know, and a nationalistic internets, like internets or networks that are very much becoming sort of just, you know, within each country. And that's a trend that's social and political as much as anything else. We gave an example on VPNs. One of the interesting things, Andrew can talk about it really quickly, is looking at, we talked a lot about VPN use and the positive effects of it as well. But again, it's also a choke point. And all of this sort of bigger discussion that we're having, and I think that Yari's kicked off a couple of years ago on consolidation on the different layers of the internet, but also politics as well, politically as well. Couple of suggestions about what to do. Obviously, security and privacy needs to be ensured. And to Stephen's point earlier, he was saying, you know, it's not bad. And obviously there needs to be a privacy aspect to it as well. But just being a little more aware of sort of how consolidation is sort of becoming a bigger issue, involving more stakeholders. I volunteer myself to do some more security research, but also in this area as well, thinking more critically and much more in depth than this paper on consolidation. So that's my quick presentation. Was that quick enough?
That was nice and quick. Yes, thank you. Okay, so I guess I guess what we want to do is, you know, what did we forget, or what might we want to revisit? We obviously talked a lot about observability and so on. So the question here is, what did we forget? And yeah, that looks pretty horrible. So what topics did we not cover that would have been covered? What topics that were mentioned briefly that are kind of maybe not outstandingly huge in the notes would need to be more covered? And if the answer is nothing, then that's pretty good. Andrew.
Hi, Steve. So, yeah, it seemed rude to leave it with nothing. So one which we sort of touched on briefly, but maybe didn't dwell on, is you rightly flagged that, you know, that there are some positive benefits from end-to-end encryption. I'd question whether privacy is one of them. I think people conflate privacy and encryption wrongly, but anyway, that's a different subject. What I think is maybe not being given a great deal of thought so far is the negative effects of encryption. And for example, since Kirsty was talking about some of the cybersecurity issues, the more signals you hide, the easier it is for malware to flourish. And certainly the paper that Dominic referred to just now, I think our contention would be if COVID happened in 5 years' time, given current trends, I personally would question whether the internet will be anything like as resilient as it has been now. So I think the negative effects of some of the current sort of trends and developments from the IETF need to be considered in the light of how they might impair resilience over the long term, because I'm quite worried about that.
Sure. I honestly don't understand how that can be considered to be something that's been forgotten, given the huge amounts of discussion we've had about it in the last number of years.
Well, we haven't really discussed, we've touched on encryption, but we haven't discussed the unintended negative effects of it in the context of resilience. I don't think we'd really discussed that in the last 2.5 sessions.
Okay, so I think we have Yari, Jared, and that's the cue for now.
Yeah, so I was actually going to maybe talk about two forgotten things, and one is maybe what Andrew just mentioned, but from a slightly different angle. So I think resilience in general we haven't really talked so much about. Like I'd be interested in understanding like infrastructure resilience and so on. Maybe that's related to what Andrew was talking about, or maybe not. But I don't think we need to go to the encryption debate right now. It may also be related to Dominic's point about consolidation. So that's one thing that I think we perhaps should have explored more in depth. At least I remember mostly the CP discussion right now. And the other thing is that we always think of repeats of the same situation when we think about problems. So another pandemic exactly like this, but I don't think that's realistic. I think we should expect that there'd be something unexpected that's, a different event. Part of a continent sinks down, or I hope not, but or maybe a security attack of some type, that DOS attack, or something else. And I think it would be important to try and not put us, too much focused on like this particular thing. Are we going to respond to, the WebEx versus other traffic prioritization issue? And the real problem that we might have 5 years from now is potentially quite different. So let's think about
that. I think we have Jared.
Yep.
And then
Yeah, I'll just jump in here and say, I think actually the pandemic has shown us something very important, which is that the internet actually worked really well in this situation. In a collaborative, multi-stakeholder environment, insert other marketing terms here, everybody seemed to work really well together during these times. The service providers upgraded links, application people went and turned the dials to make more bandwidth available, and because we had this global network available, many people were able to continue to function, continue to work. So there was not as much of a there was definitely a global economic impact, but it wasn't as bad as it would have been if we did not have these collaboration tools, these technologies and things available. So I want us to not lose sight of that, despite all of the horrible things that we've lived through this year, there's really some amazing outcomes from this, in that, my children are doing school virtually. That's working not as ideal as I as a parent would like, but it is working. And yeah, we still have these issues with, the tug between encryption and privacy and all that, and the application uniformity that that seems to be coming out of the IETF. But I think when we're talking about the impact, if we didn't have this network, how much worse off would we have been? And that is something that I think we should at least think about for a moment.
So I think Brian is next in the queue, and then a few more people. I'll try and catch up on that in a minute. Brian?
So I want to rip off what Jared said. Everything Jared said, yeah. In SRE, we generally, when we look at sort of like a big event, like an outage or something that was a near miss, we write a postmortem, and in that postmortem, we have 3 sections: what went poorly, what went well, and where we got lucky. And I've thought a lot about, like, so you know, the fact that the collaborative multi-stakeholder environment worked well. I've thought a lot about whether that's what worked well and where we got lucky, and I think it's a little bit of both. I think that the fact that it's a network of networks, like the very underlying architecture, that there's not sort of like I mean, think for a moment if we were in a situation in the United States, or I should say you were in a situation in the United States where capacity upgrades needed to be done by directly by the National Telecommunications Infrastructure Authority. Like where that was a federal response. Given the rest of the federal response to this pandemic, I think having a multi-stakeholder, multi-operator network was superior to that architecture. On the consolidation point, though, I think that's where we got lucky, right? Like so, like Jared said, everyone was working very hard together. I know we were working very hard, and we're all. Our incentives are aligned, right? Like we all want our services to work well, so we have to do our part of that service working well. But in a more consolidated environment, it would only take one of the hyperscalers having done poorly, right? Like so, something having gone wrong in one of the application areas to have had a seriously negative impact. Like the decentralization of it and the multi-stakeholderism of it, I think, was a definite win. But I think that it was a little riskier than it needed to be because of the consolidation aspect of this.
So I think we have a building queue. We don't have that much time. I'm going to suggest that we basically lump in all these 3 topics all at once. So if you want to talk to any of them, jump in the queue now. And then in, let's say, another 10 minutes, Yari has a couple of wrap-up slides for the whole thing. And then I'd like to kind of just have some kind of feedback on the event format as well. So let's keep some time for that. So we've a half hour left. Let's take 10 minutes, try and take 10 minutes more for this topic, where the queue is Kirsty, Larry, Colin, Maria, Jana, Oliver. So Kirsty.
Thank you, Stephen. I hear the need to be brief, and that works for me. So I just want to talk about like stuff we missed. I think however we write up and whatever we collate, we should just be really clear on what we mean when we say the internet worked well. Like it's certainly true that people could stay connected, and it's certainly true that like we manage capacity well, and but just as I've already alluded to, different users have different needs, and it working well, like for me that would have been not a single scam. Like we could have taken them all down immediately, right? So there are gaps for me from a security point of view. And I think it's just the stakeholders we have on the call are, like rightly ISPs and measurement focused and stuff. But I think we should just be kind of clear on what we mean by that. From the security point of view, at least, we've had a good discussion today, and I think that's been very valuable. That has been a key topic in the workshop, as well as the resilience and the traffic volume and management of that. So yeah, thank you. Being brief.
Thanks. Brevity, welcome. So Larry.
Check on the same point. The internet worked well for the people who had access to it, sufficient access for them to get their work done, and for the kids to get their own work done. And then for everyone else, it worked terribly. So that's all I wanted to say.
Colin?
Yeah, so just on a couple of points. I mean, on the issue of unintended effects of better security. I mean, I agree that the issues of security have been discussed massively, but certainly anything other than encrypt all the things gets pushback, and pretty strong pushback in the IETF. And that's fine, but there are perhaps nuanced reasons to not quite encrypt everything, which are getting lost, and we have quite a one-sided debate there. In terms of general resilience, we spend a lot of time when we're talking about improving the internet architecture discussing performance. And we spend a lot of time discussing alternative architectures which improve performance for certain types of applications or improve quality of service for certain types of applications. We don't really discuss internet architecture in terms of how it affects resilience of the network. And I worry that we're getting increasingly complicated, increasingly performant architectures, which are getting so close to using all the capacity, all the features that we have nothing left for resilience and robustness at the end. And we maybe need to focus more on that and more on what happens when things are not working well, when we're evolving the network. Thanks.
So I think the queue is Maria, Jana, Oliver, and actually on the resilience, it's interesting that the IAB tried to create a mailing list for that topic around a year ago, and there was a bunch of initial discussion, and then nobody wanted to do anything, and it just kind of wasted away. And so I think the queue is Maria, Jana, and Oliver.
So one point we didn't talk a lot about, and maybe we don't have the right people, is the economical impacts or changes that we've seen, and the question if they might stay. So for example, we've seen that operators are suddenly able to roll out bandwidth very quickly. Are they able to roll out equally much bandwidth in the near future? And why did it go so quickly? What were the problems here? But also about measurement data. Usually there are actually economical points why measurement data are not shared. So is that something that might change in future or not? So I think there are a lot of things we've been talking about which are actually not technical points, but points where economical decision was made, and the question is, does it change in future?
Yeah, I think.
Stephen, I want to up level just a bit. This is a. I'm going to try to be brief. I promise, Stephen. I want to make a point that usually doesn't. We'll just make the point. There is one of the things that I would like to talk about here just briefly is the unintended consequences that we've seen for having the internet in society during this time. I'm up-leveling it. I'm not talking about just unintended consequences in particular fields or particular areas of network, of the network and so on, but just generally in society. And I think there's some points on the chat that are being made about this. So one example is, as Jared said, I completely agree that we should be grateful for the things that the network has made possible. I'm very deeply aware of that, and I think about that all the time. This is the problem, however, is for example, schools have continued to go on as things moved online. However, dealing with 2 teenage children who are now going to school right now online, that is a completely disastrous and sucky experience. And it's actually, in some ways, made it worse for some students and has been worked amazingly well for some others. This is true across the board. In meetings now, when I go in, one of the first things for the past 6 months, I've started my meetings with this: how is everybody doing? And some people are actually falling off the cliff, despite the fact that you're supposed to continue working as though things are normal. The curriculum at school is continuing as though things are normal. It's going at the same pace. But so we are producing something here that is quite different. We have to be cognizant of that. There are some unintended consequences. Things are continuing as though they are normal, where maybe putting the brakes hard might actually be the right answer. I'm not saying that's what should be done. I'm just saying that there is something here to think about carefully. Just because we have the facade of school happening doesn't mean that school is actually happening or meaningful education is actually happening. So on a broader scale, we know that the pandemic has deepened not just the digital divide, but existing inequalities or inequities in society in so many ways. And to the extent that technology amplifies intent, I believe that all technology, all it does, it amplifies intent. I do want us to think about what the internet has done for society during this time. what intent has it amplified and what divides it has amplified. This is not just about technical architecture, but about what we want to build for society, broadly speaking. And what do we want to amplify? What did we end up amplifying?
Yeah, actually, I mean, I think one interesting thing I noticed is that I think a lot of the time the contention that our students suffer from is not related to the network, but devices and rooms in houses is the real kind of choke point for a bunch of people as well. So, I think Oliver. Sorry, go ahead, Jenna.
And I was just very briefly going to say that my point here was much more about education itself, right? And if we think that teaching is, if we believe that the value here of education is dumping information down into a student, then sure, we managed it. But that's what I'm talking about as values. Like we are facilitating some things, but I don't think we are clear about exactly what it is that we should be facilitating, and if we are facilitating the things that we want to be. This is really a question about values, about intent, and that's a much higher level conversation. We are building technology which is amplifying intent, whether we want to or whether we like it or not. But I think as engineers, we try to walk away from intent and simply say, well, all I'm doing is building this security piece or this bandwidth piece or whatever it is. But we are the ones building this technology. We are the ones who are amplifying these that we are amplifying.
Okay, Oliver?
So I'm just thinking like about what are the lessons learned from the 3 sessions that we had, and like going back to bringing like what you started earlier, bringing structure into what did we actually discuss, what did we actually learn from that. To my perspective, so there's always like 2 sides of a coin that these discussions fall into. So we can take on one side of the coin, we have the success story that in general, the internet worked very well. So right now we are having this meeting here, virtual, it's all working. We have webcams on, it does a great job. So, and this is what we have seen in some of the talks. Then on the other side of the coin, we have a lot of punctual issues. So isolated issues, and for example, oh, there was congestion at this peering link. Oh, there was an edge cluster, cache cluster of a CDN that got overloaded. Oh, there was like a certain set of students didn't have access to like proper bandwidth to consume study material for their online courses. So that's a lot of isolated issues. We have a lot of understanding about these ones. So we saw a lot of data points on this one. And then we have the general perspective on, yeah, the internet as such didn't broke down. There's, of course, some stuff that we didn't understand quite well from the perspectives that we have taken so far. So on the general perspective, we have this interesting discussion about the digital divide. So we saw some data points on the DSL access capacities and how this correlates to income regions. This was very interesting, but this is clearly something like how the digital divide was being boosted by this whole situation. This is something that we probably don't have, like, it's a general aspect that we don't have a good understanding of. On the isolated side, so the other side of the coin, we had lots of discussions about how we can map all of these isolated issues, congestion here, overloaded links there, other things, how to map this into like the general perspective, how to create like an abstract and an abstract view on that. So I think that this is something that we're missing. We can play the same game on what Brian said. Did we get lucky or did we not get lucky? So on one side of the coin, I would argue that we didn't get lucky, or it wasn't just pure luck, because like a lot of the changes that we have seen, so that all the well-equipped ISPs managed to quickly provision bandwidth, and that we, for example, have robots in the meet-me rooms of peering facilities and IXPs and so on that don't suffer from lockdowns and can still like establish cross connects. That's not luck. That's like very proper engineering, and that helped us a lot. On the other hand, I would say, so that's the other side of the coin. We probably got lucky, that these traffic changes didn't got to an extreme. So over provisioning and shifts in the peak times, they probably saved us quite a lot. So this could have been like way worse. And I would say that on this side we got lucky.
Okay, so I think we have Jari has like about 4 slides. So Jari, and we have 20 minutes. So I suspect Yari's 4 slides could take up 20 minutes plus 20 hours, but
I would only like to speak for like 2 or 3 minutes. But can I share instead of you, because I have updates?
Oh yeah, okay, sure, you can. Do I have to do something?
I think I'll just press share and let's see if it works.
Maybe I just hit stop sharing. But then I do want to try and get feedback on the format of this workshop, which itself is an experiment.
We'll see my screen now.
Yeah, you're not sharing yet, or we're not seeing you sharing.
Maybe I can pilot you. Oh, Jari has the bubble.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Maybe that's the problem that you were.
You have the sharing bubble, but you're not sharing it.
Okay. Well, let's go with Stephen's version.
No, it's coming. It's coming.
Oh, okay.
There we are.
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
So I just want to go through this real quick. It's not the summary of the workshop. It's my personal summary, and sort of I guess this is the Oliver's 2 sides of the coin first. So on one hand, we had like a reasonably good situation. The internet really worked well, which I think we can say that. We also have lots of wonderful data by you all and of course others in the world about what actually happened. And as has been reported, there were lots of people and organizations that were very motivated to make sure that stuff actually works and everybody gets the thing. And I think we can also say that the internet actually is well suited for adapting to these new situations for various reasons. So that's all good. But the other side of the coin is, if I can switch, let's see if I can, yeah, there you go. So the other side of the coin is that even if we have some measurements, we can't actually observe everything. It's very limited. We can't be basically looking at packets instead of like, well, we're measuring packets, and the real measurement, I guess, is like, did this kid graduate from school as planned or not? So there's a lot of sort of room for doing more maybe and trying to understand what the effects of this are. We also have limited means to control traffic. Like even if I wanted to, have high priority for this versus something else, I couldn't. We have limited ways for networks and apps to collaborate. We had one type of situation. We could, of course, argue that in a different situation, the results could differ. We also have this situation that the internet is now far more important for all of us than it was before. We also have, just talked about this digital divide and other societal effects. So clearly there's room for making things better. So just because it worked well doesn't mean that we're free to not do anything. We have to make it better. But of course, there's also like all these other improvements then, and I think we entered some of that discussion today, that security and so forth, that we already knew that we have a huge problem here, and there. And we need to deal with that, pandemic or not. Then I also wrote this to-do list in 2 categories like this. What can we do to understand the internet state better, distribute your measurement information better, even talking about it in the society. So this is what the internet is doing, and it's how it's helping, and this is where we need to improve, and so on. And then continuing expanding the coverage of the things that we measure, but then also measuring these additional things like quality of experience. And the other category is system improvements or ecosystem improvements. And so it's not just about technical stuff. Like the IETF in particular always wants to write an RFC, but you know, a lot of this is also like, you know, how did the people in the different operators talk to each other? Were they able to find each other and so on? That may not be an RFC or technical thing, but could be a thing that we need to improve, or maybe not. Maybe it's already perfect, and you know, everybody knows everybody in Nanook anyway. So what's the problem? The other side of this is that, like, this education, implementation, improvement, security practices, there's a lot of stuff that's outside standards and may need some work. But then on the like technical standards and technology level, we could talk about like network app collaboration, perhaps at this aggregate level that was being mentioned by Jana. Note that I didn't discuss like this DSCP bits or prioritization, because that seemed like almost not possible. We've talked about resilience. We talked about the potential effects of centralization or consolidation, how that may impact things. We talked about DDoS defense. That was part of the reason that I said earlier that we should look at other things than this current pandemic, because we could have a situation where we're actually being bombarded by some network attacks, and that could also be a bad situation. So maybe that should be part of our toolkit, and you know, we're not as good with that as we perhaps should be. And then obviously we will need to have resource reservations and full control by the authorities, because otherwise nothing will work correctly. And this is a joke. I didn't get that. Anyway, so that was my piece, and I'll stop talking now. Maybe I'll stop sharing, unless people have questions on this.
So I think I'm sharing my screen now. Has that become visible to people?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So we're down like the last 10 minutes. So I guess we'll take two things together. If people have, you know, stuff that hasn't been mentioned already that might, or actions that are pretty concrete, we can list a couple of those. And if there's any feedback on the format, because again, I think that's useful because it's the first time we've done this kind of thing. So input, please. And again, just join the queue if it turns into needing a queue. And if you're the first one, just start talking.
So Jared here. I just wanted to comment briefly. I think this worked out reasonably well for a format, especially having it distributed over 3 days. I think helped make it a lot easier to pay attention. I'm also wondering out loud as I'm reading news of further lockdowns, whether or not, you know, this maybe is something we revisit in a few months as well. But I think the format worked relatively well, and I'm very happy with the participation that we had.
Kirsty, and then Andrew and Brian. So Kirsty.
Yeah, thank you. Just on the format, I thought it was good to have it over 3 days, to have short sessions. Appreciated the break in the middle as well. I think it would have been helpful to have slides and a bit more notice of time. I don't know how everyone else found scheduling this quite quickly, but it was difficult. It is good to have it near IETF as well, where my brain is like in that sort of space. But yeah, thank you for running it. I know it's difficult to collate and bring people together when they're all distributed working, but no, I thought overall it was good. Just a few things for improvement. Thank you.
And following on the positivity first, completely agree with everything Kirsty just said. Pretty much, I particularly agree. Actually, doing it over 3 days with a day's gap in between was useful for reflection. So I think that was especially helpful. I'm also extremely relieved that Jason has remained positive. Good to see he's confirmed that in the chat. So I think that's an amazing achievement that should be noted. And then finally, on the other column on the actions, I think it is just worth posing the question: is the direction of travel of resilience of the internet going up or down? My personal contention is it's going down, but I think that's something which needs paying attention to. And I don't know if there's any metric that could be constructed to measure that over time, but I think it will be a good thing to try.
Brian?
Yeah, so I'm a gigantic fan of this format as well, especially with the days off in between, although I would like to hear feedback on the format from somebody in PST, so UTC -7, because I suspect that waking up that early in the morning 3 days in a row is just, or 3 days not in a row, like sort of just messes up your whole sleep schedule. I also noticed that we don't have any Australians on the call as I see, so maybe there's like some selection bias on how awesome this particular time was. With respect to resilience going up and down, I think we could have an entire other workshop on that. +1 to, I forget who it was, Jared, I think, on revisiting this. You know, we're going back into lockdown, or we're going to have a winter, revisiting this in the spring and seeing how the internet did. I think revisiting later, I'd like to spend a little bit less time on the infrastructure, unless the infrastructure just happens to blow up, which I don't think it will. And a little bit more time on Jana's questions, right? Like, so the internet is good at amplifying the things the internet is good at amplifying, and we've done a really good job of making sure it can keep doing that. And I think that sort of next, by the next time we go through one of these experiences, we'll have more information, or at least anecdotes about what's what it's good at and what it's bad at, or more information and anecdotes about sort of what the societal impacts are. And I'd like to dig into those a little bit more. Might need a slightly different guest list, but please put me on it.
Okay, the queue is currently empty. I guess I have another question, is, which I typed in the chat, if the IAB or somebody's organizing a workshop like this in future, after we can all travel again, what bits of this format should we try keep, or should we just go right back to all traveling to Switzerland and having cheese in funny ways? Ben?
Well, I actually queued myself before you asked that question, but I think I can address that a bit too. I like the 3-day format. And the thing I particularly like about the 3-day format is that it gives people time to think about what was said one day before you come back for another day. And if we were doing it in person, the 3-day format might be harder with that extra time. And if there was some way to preserve that, the ability to go back and cogitate and maybe have side conversations and then come back to the subject the next day, I think it would be good. I put myself in the queue actually to say that I like the 3-day format, but I want to push a counter opinion about doing it right before the IETF. And this may just be me, but what I've got happening this week is several different activities. They're all trying to get a lot of work in because they all know I'm not available next week. And it's not so much that they contend for specific time or time slots, but they're happening across different time zones. So, I've got this being moderately early morning, other things that are late night, and suddenly it's going to be kind of like next week where there's no period where one can get a full night of sleep in. And that was exaggerated by the, being right before the IETF. But I understand other people like to do all their IETF thinking kind of in a period of time together, and it helps them. So it works both ways.
Mirya, I think, unless I missed somebody, in which case apologies.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the big value of the 3-day format was that we actually had some time in the meantime to chat and discuss and so on. So maybe we can go for some hybrid format. We have some online discussion first and then maybe meet. in person for dinner or whatever. I don't know. It's also missing a little bit the side conversations and the coughing breaks. About actions or conclusions. So I think I read the papers and these kind of things. I think I learned a lot about really understanding the situation a little bit better, how things happen, what work well, and so on. I'm not sure I got a lot of actions out of that, and maybe I have to review the minutes we've been taking. But maybe the main point really about this workshop is just to document what we've learned, so we get like a common understanding what happened, or we can just increase our understanding about how the internet works.
Robin?
Okay, this is Robin. In fact, I'm okay with the format of the workshop, though it's a little hard because this is a little late, but it's also very exciting to discuss it with everyone. But regarding these actions and conclusions, I think from my own point of view, I think in this process, I have one this point. I think is important is the automation, because that because we talk about sometimes there's the experience of the user is not good in the process of the COVID-19. But I want to know this how the application and the network respond to this work, and how long will it take? Because this is also an important performance of our network and the application. But it seems that we always talk about the internet capacity is okay. But from my point of view, maybe the automation of the network adjustment can also be taken into account. That's my point.
Okay, so I've tried to capture that, Robin. We can correct it later if I got it wrong, which I may have done. Okay, we're kind of at 3 minutes to the hour. I guess I'd just like to say thanks to everybody for turning up for the really interesting discussions. We will try to copy all the text from the pad without deleting it first. That'll be good. And produce a workshop report that'll be, I guess, done in the Git repo. Maria, I think, has created a template or a draft, initial draft. And I think that's it, unless anybody else from the program committee wants to also say thanks for turning up or something similar.
Maybe a note on the report. So I already also created some sections for the measurement part. So if those people who presented want to actually put some sentences there, that would be very welcome. Otherwise, other input is also welcome, of course. And with that, also thank you from my side. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for everybody engaging so nicely, providing slides kind of last minute like.
Okay, thanks. And we're finishing right on time. So I hope to actually see all you guys sometime soonish over food and beverages. It's although I also like this format, it's much better to actually meet really face to face. But hopefully we'll do that in the not too distant. And I think with that, let's kind of close proceedings and go to the bar, whatever your nearest bar is. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen.
Thanks.
Yep, thanks.
Thanks.
If you're the last one here, somebody wanted the chat.
Jared, I didn't get that because of the preponderance of beeps. But I will. Oh, okay. Maybe you told me to copy that. I'll try.
You can stop the recording.